Hello there. We now start with the New Republic and the origins of the two-party system. This is roughly the decade after the Constitution first went into effect, starting in 1789. So basically the decade of the 1790s, which, as we'll see, was one of great political drama, intensity, and very ugly and nasty partisan conflict at times, but a very important one in our nation's history. This unit will be primarily about government and politics. We could see it as these first 10 years after the Constitution as working to try to fill in the blanks that the Constitution had left out. We might more profitably think of the Constitution itself as a blueprint for government, an outline for government that still needed to be filled in. In some ways, the framers of the Constitution thought of it that way themselves. So in this first decade, once it goes into effect, during the administrations of President Washington and Adams, our first two presidents, we see a lot of the blanks filled in. For instance, political parties, which hadn't been mentioned in the Constitution whatsoever, they start to take shape and some defining form during this period. America's financial system and fiscal policy was laid down during this period. Fiscal policy being, for lack of a better way of saying it at the moment, the connection between governments and a capitalist economy. We see the laying down of some government institutions that hadn't been talked about in the Constitution. The president establishing a cabinet of advisors, for instance. That wasn't something that was dealt with in Philadelphia in 1787. And we see some political norms established, the way in which different institutions and branches of government deal with each other. George Washington famously, early in his presidency, had a rift with the United States Senate because he didn't like the way they addressed him and treated him and asked him questions as if he was on trial. At least that was his viewpoint, and he got up in a huff and stormed out. So even some of the ways in which politicians, government branches, institutions, agencies deal with each other, some of that was laid down here. And lastly, but not least, the role of the press in politics, what we could call the political press, really took its first shape during the 1790s, and we could say this and everything that I've just mentioned has really been in place ever since. James Madison, of course, the primary architect of the Constitution, understood as well as anyone else, if not better, that there was a tough task awaiting the new young republic. And this was a new young republic. The Constitution is fresh, shiny new, and there was a lot of work to be done. Madison understood that part of the job here was to try to do as effective a job as possible as balancing the needs of liberty and freedom on one side, protecting the rights of the individual, which was part of the value system in which the American Revolution had been fought, part of a republican system of government, which they now had, and balancing that out with the needs of stability and law and order on the other side, which is a delicate balance indeed. Madison said, showing that he understood the nuances of all this, quote, "Liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as by the abuses of power." This is a recognition that even freedom can sometimes get in the way of freedom. One person's freedom might violate someone else's freedom. To give just one example, which we'll get to later in the class, slaveholders in the 19th century, after this time period, and even before to some degree, when faced with the possibility that slavery might be made illegal someday, one of the arguments that slaveholders in the South made was, you can't take away our slaves because you'd be depriving us of our liberty or freedom to own slaves. So you're saying, Mr. Slaveholder, that you can't take away my freedom to keep freedom from other people? And that's exactly what they were saying. They were saying that. So Madison was well aware that it's tricky to balance freedom with stability, law and order, justice, all those things together. Overall, I think the this early generation of leaders in the first 10 years of our history under the Constitution did a remarkably good job. There was quite a lot of talent in the room, let's put it that way. Remember that in the ratifying conventions during the kind of political campaign leading up to those ratifications of the Constitution, that a Bill of Rights was promised that had been voted down at the Constitutional Convention, and they'd promised it as a way to kind of get more support for the Constitution. Whether or not it actually helped to put the Constitution over the top and get it ratified in at least 9+ states is hard to know, but it may have. James Madison did follow through, even though he'd voted against the Bill of Rights on the convention floor in Philadelphia. It had been George Mason who had pushed the idea a great deal. And George Mason's ideas are somewhat still behind this, as he'd worked on earlier a Bill of Rights, not called that, but something close to it, for the state of Virginia. But it was James Madison that wrote the first 10 amendments. And you can see the part of a speech that he gave here. And I would argue that this speech, if you look at it, is typical political BS, kind of mumbo-jumbo. Madison sort of saying the kind of patriotic thing that he thought was necessary to say. It appears that his heart wasn't totally in the Bill of Rights at this time, though I believe he came to warm up to the importance of a Bill of Rights later on. But nonetheless, since they had promised one, they were wise politically to follow through on it. Once again, we get back to George Washington himself. He's been a big part of our class for a while now, and he's, in a sense, playing the same role. He's now being called, by this time, the indispensable man, and he was perceived as being indispensable, but it's the same kind of thing. Remember, he's the one person in the country that's proven, the only person that's really proven that he can take disparate colonies / states and bind them together and get them to cooperate with each other. He did that, of course, through his organization and leadership of the Continental Army. But he's the one person that has proven that he can think and act continentally, that he can bring the nation together. And that's the same reason that he's considered the glue at the Constitutional Convention, that he was the one person that showed up there whose mere presence made a difference, because, again, people had at least some more confidence that that project, the Constitution, might get done if Washington was there, since he had a history of rallying the country around him. And now, once again, once he becomes first president, it's the same thing. Like he didn't want to go to the Constitutional Convention, it does appear that he didn't really want to become president, and he tried to deny it. In fact, even after he agreed to serve one term, he had planned to retire before a second term, and he was talked out of it there. So he was basically talked into serving both terms as president against his will, showing, as always, that Washington had a real strong tendency to devote himself to the public interests, to the national good. He saw himself as duty-bound, obligated to serve the country. I don't want to paint the picture too extremely. He was an ambitious guy. I'm not saying he was completely selfless. We don't want to turn him into a hero, but his capacity for sacrificing for the country and so a sense of duty to the country, I think, is outstanding. So the indispensable man part of this, and the reason he ends up really holding the presidency and running for office, that office twice, is because everybody in both political parties, as we'll see, as the parties start to form, practically begged him. Madison, Hamilton, his former artillery general, Henry Knox, a fellow Virginian big-name politician, Edmund Randolph, and many others either came to visit him at Mount Vernon, his estate in Virginia, or wrote him and just made emphatic pleas that he must be the president of the United States. Everybody knew that if he did throw his hat in the ring and run, that he would win, which was, of course, true. But what they're basically saying is that this is a young, baby, unproven country, and if you don't serve Mr. Washington as the first president, there's every reason to believe that this thing might come unglued, that the country might not survive even its first 4 years. And then when he wanted to retire after those 4 years, they were still afraid. Oh my God, we're still a young country, not very strong yet. We're afraid that if you're not there, you're the indispensable man, that this country may not survive. We might get attacked by a foreign country and defeated and conquered, or whatever else. Now, was that true? We can never know that, because he was there for the first 8 years, of the country under the Constitution. So, but the point is that was the perception, and it was widespread. It was basically ubiquitous. Everyone thought that Washington must be there, or that there's at least a chance that the country will fail. That's how strong, how powerful his reputation was. And he was hugely popular with the public as well, which probably shouldn't surprise us. So on the screen and on the outline, I've written that he was a non-party Federalist. This gets us into the two political parties, and we'll come back to this. But there were two parties formed, first two in American history, the Republican Party and this one, the Federalist Party. But George Washington, truth be told, hated political parties and said so again and again and again. He's very open about this. He never joined one or other of the parties his entire career. However, Washington, as president, had to make lots of decisions about policy. He had to sign bills into law or veto them, and far more often than not, he ended up siding with Federalist thinking and policy and bills than he did with Republican ideas or policies. Another way to say that would be to see that he sided with Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of the Treasury, far more than he sided with Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State under this guy. Washington was also extremely realistic. He was a realist by nature. A realist is someone who doesn't strive to change the world too much, thinks that we should be more limited and not quite as far-thinking in our goals, as opposed to an idealist. An idealist, I think all societies probably need a balance of realists and idealists, but an idealist is someone who's constantly thinking about the way the world should be and working towards those ends. We want the world to be a better place, and this is the way the world is. This is the way it should be. And the idealist focuses much more attention on the way the world should be. A realist, as Washington was, doesn't focus so much on that. It doesn't mean they don't think there's the possibility of change or that there shouldn't be any change, but they don't feel that it's realistic to think too far out ahead. So Washington, as a rock-ribbed realist, believed that, here's what's in front of us, here's what we can do right now, and it's sort of a waste of time and energy to sort of think beyond that. Washington, as always, was a very balanced leader. The same characteristics and traits that made him a great military leader made him one of our better presidents, in my estimation. And those traits, not that all military leaders, gifted military leaders, make good presidents or leaders of a country, but in Washington's case, I think it did. He tended to exercise very good judgment as president. If he wasn't the brilliant idea man, he could judge good ideas, even if they came from someone else. He was open-minded. He was willing to listen to others, willing to listen to criticism, was confident enough in himself to bring on a very talented staff, which included Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, two of the most gifted individuals in the country, politically and intellectually. And Washington was confident enough of himself, to have these guys around him. It might sound obvious that leaders always want to bring a talented staff, to surround themselves with, but I think actually the ability to do that, to live with that, is much more rare than it might seem. It takes an extremely confident person to bring on lots and lots of talent, because if you're the leader and you bring on guys that are more talented than yourself, they might show you up, and people might start asking the question, well, why is this guy the leader if everybody around him seems to have better and more ideas than he did? But Washington, I think, his own self-confidence made it easy for him. So in essence, he could admit, okay, Alexander Hamilton, that's a brilliant idea, but I'm still George friggin' Washington, and you're not, and I'm the guy who makes the decisions, and I'm confident in my own judgment and place to make those decisions. Washington was cautious, like he was in the American Revolution, but cautious, again, in the best sense of the word. We tend to use the word caution in a negative sense these days, but there are times to be aggressive and times to be cautious, and Washington was cautious unless he had to be something else. So I do think these qualities helped a great deal as first president. Washington had to exercise balance in a somewhat different way as well. He had a tough job here as first president. This gets us sort of into the third element on the screen, understanding the enormity of the job. But Washington realized as the first president that if he didn't get a lot of things right, then the presidents that followed were going to have a tough time as well. So he put a lot of pressure on himself to try to lay down precedents, try to establish doing things a certain way, the right way, so that other presidents that followed would have a workable model to emulate. And overall, I think he did a good job of this as well, and he made a conscious effort at it. But it wasn't easy because he had no models himself to work for. There were no presidents before him, and there were a lot of tight spaces that he had to try to get through. Just to give you one example, and this gets us back to the word balance again, it was kind of a balancing act here, a tightrope wire act that he had to do. Americans at the time were certainly not going to accept someone that acted, behaved, was perceived as a king. Right? They had just fought a war to get away from a king, not entirely. The British government was pretty much run by Parliament, but King George III was part of that as well. So Americans were left with a bitter taste in their mouth with regard to monarchy. So a president could not act like a king. However, in those days, Americans also were not about to accept some guy that looked like and sounded like an average Joe, an average guy. It's changed a great deal. In our day and age today, we actually like our leaders to sound like us. We like them to sound like a guy you could just sit down and have a beer with and watch the ball game with. But that was not true in the 18th century. So think about how difficult a task that is. Washington had to not look like a king, but he also had to sort of look and behave as if he was kind of above everybody else. Well, there's not a lot of room between those two. If you're acting like you're above everybody else, couldn't you be seen as acting like a king? And I think the answer is yes. So again, a good example of some of the difficulties of the job for him. I think he actually navigated that tightrope, that tight wire act quite well. He scheduled with his staff. They brainstormed and came up with ideas for Washington meeting with the public. I think there was one dinner once a week and one luncheon once a week, where people were brought in and had lunch with the president. They weren't usually just totally average people, influential or fairly well-off businessmen, these types. But Washington then used that to try to make himself look approachable. And honestly, Washington was not approachable as an individual. And to us today, he would look more like he was behaving like a king. He really would. But I think in the 18th century, it didn't look like that. He probably looked something short of that, which is what he wanted. But enough, but authoritative enough that Americans would accept it. Americans wanted somebody that looked like an authority figure. One current historian says that Washington always carried himself like he was sort of levitating in the air, like he was sort of walking above you. He did have a somewhat arrogant and aloof air about him. What's amazing about that is people that are arrogant and aloof are usually not liked, but Washington was, if not liked, he was respected by everybody. So people tended, I think, not to mind his arrogance. They tended to, in a sense, embrace it and think more highly of him for it. Washington was not somebody who was good with the gift of gab, didn't like small talk, sort of, was silent, sort of with his nose up in the air much of the time. It must have been very uncomfortable at gatherings, at official dinners. If you sat at his table and he didn't say anything because he wasn't someone who liked to make small talk, you were, what do? Do you speak first? Does he want you to speak? Does he want you to wait for him to speak? It must have been really uncomfortable indeed. A lot of wives of other political leaders wrote in their diaries or in letters about dancing with George Washington. You have to dance with different people at these big gala events. And they always said the same thing. Washington knows all the steps to the dances, but there's sort of no passion or energy or emotion or fun involved in his dancing. He knows all the steps properly, and then he just kind of goes back and sits down. In many ways, Washington was kind of a cold fish, very unapproachable. In fact, there's a great story that involves Alexander Hamilton, who knew him all too well since he served as his most important assistant or aide-de-camp during the American Revolution, throughout most of the Revolution. So these guys had worked together and known each other for a long time by the time Washington became president. So they were all sitting at one of these dinners, I forget what the occasion was, waiting for Washington to arrive. He hadn't come in yet, and Alexander Hamilton was sitting there, and I forget who he was sitting next to. One of the other big-name politicians of the era, might have been Benjamin Rush, and they were just chatting. And the other guy said to Hamilton, when President Washington comes in, I'm going to walk up to him and put my arm around him and invite he and his wife over to me and my wife's house for dinner. And Hamilton said, you're going to do what? He said, I'm going to go put my arm around him and invite him over to dinner. And Hamilton didn't really listen to the invite over to dinner part. He was zeroed in on the put your hand on his shoulder. And Hamilton said, you are not going to put your hand on George Washington's shoulder. And the guy kind of like laughed it off, like, why not? Of course I am. And Hamilton bet him, I forget what it was, like $10, $20. That was a lot more money then in those days. And the guy said, I'll take the bet. So Washington walks into the room. The guy walks up to him. Hamilton must have known what was going to happen. Must have been just, sitting there with expectant sort of joy. And sure enough, he, puts his arm on Washington's shoulder, and Washington, without saying a word, just sort of looked back and like it was a bug on his shoulder, didn't say one thing, and picked up the guy's fingers and like handed them back to him and turned around and walked off and didn't say one word. And the funniest part is that, of course, Hamilton lost the bet, because the bet was you're not going to put your arm or hand on the shoulder of George Washington. And the guy said, yes, I am, and he did. But the guy actually said after the fact, because that was the worst $20 or $10 I've ever made, because he learned a big lesson. Hamilton already knew how that was going to go down, because he knew the guy so well. So Washington was not particularly approachable, which would make him look like a king to us today. But in the 18th century, I think he did pull it off. He looked like an authority figure, enough to be respected by Americans who expected a guy like that, but not so much that he looked like a king. We need to meet the principals here or whatever, and they're all people we've met before, so this isn't a new cast of characters. George Washington as first president, John Adams, who got second place in the first presidential election. By the way, George Washington got all of the votes possible. The Electoral College, remember, was not a vote of the people. There were 69 electors, elites in all of the states, who elected George Washington unanimously. So only 69 individuals got to vote in the election that put Washington in the White House in 1780. It wasn't the White House yet, but in the executive office in 1789. And this Constitution had stipulated, this is going to be a problem later on, as we'll see, one of the mistakes made at the Constitutional Convention, one of the bugs in the Constitution, that the guy who comes in second place, it was stipulated, in the run for presidency, automatically becomes the vice president. and that ended up being John Adams. Adams was the first of many vice presidents to learn that being the vice president is often being put out to pasture. You're in kind of a wilderness. In many ways, oddly enough, it's kind of a nothing job. You can't afford not to take it because it can be a springboard to the presidency, both, of course, if the president dies or gets assassinated, which has happened, but also just because you have such visibility, and it it has a reputation, of course, that's high up there. So you take it and you can get elected. Been vice presidents that have then went on to run and become president. But most of the time it's kind of a nothing job, and you're often cut out of the loop. If you look at the little 4-minute film clip that I put on here that I think will help you understand this unit, you'll see at the end of the meeting when Adams is in the room, Washington says, "I need to meet with my cabinet now. Mr. Adams, could you leave us alone?" And so this is what happens to Adams and many subsequent vice presidents. They get kind of frozen out because they're not part of the president's cabinet, and the president oftentimes leaves them out. And remember, John Adams was a big name, big powerful guy by this time, so was used to wielding power, and he will become president in his own right, but he didn't know that at the time. And he bitched and moaned and complained and got very emotional about being kind of left out of business. James Madison, who you see on the right, the main architect of the Constitution, he actually didn't get a cabinet position and went back to Virginia and ran for the House of Representatives, one house of Congress as a representative, and won, which made him a Republican. Again, we'll get back to the party system in the first Congress, but it made him kind of the congressman, since he was already the guy who essentially framed the Constitution and wrote the Bill of Rights. So Madison wasn't just any congressman, he was the congressman. The president established a cabinet. This is something, again, one of those blanks that had to be filled in, since the Constitution was no more than a blueprint. So cabinet was not written into the Constitution. This was something that was created, which still exists to this day. And there were only 4 cabinet positions. Washington appointed, who you don't see on the screen, as Secretary of War, Henry Knox, his former artillery commander. That position is now called Secretary of Defense. As the first Attorney General, he appointed Edmund Randolph, a fellow Virginian, I mentioned once already. And the two on the screen here, by far the two most important, as first Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Hamilton, who we know a lot about already, and as first Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, who we're going to learn more about, but certainly we do know something, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and another leading light in the Continental Congress during the American Revolution and the run-up to it. But George Washington's presidency was an extremely difficult one, though he acquitted himself well, I believe anyway. Lots of challenges. And one of the challenges was that he had 2 heavyweights, Hamilton and Jefferson, 2 brilliant individuals, both of whom were not only gifted, but they were incredibly ambitious, incredibly confident in themselves, confident that their ideas were correct, and both of them had extremely different ideas, and came to not only despise the other person's ideas, believe that they were wrong, they believed that each other's ideas were dangerous for the country. Hamilton believed Jefferson's ideas were actually dangerous for the country. Jefferson, probably even more so, that Hamilton's could be ruinous for the country. But they also came to personally loathe and detest each other. So it made for a very difficult, extra difficult presidency for Washington, because he had to try to play like referee between his 2 most gifted cabinet leaders. And to make it even worse, he didn't know when he appointed them, because the political parties hadn't quite formed yet, they formed just after this, that they both would become the creator of the first and second political parties in American history. Thomas Jefferson created the Republican Party in order to organize against what he thought were Hamilton's dangerous ideas, and then in response, Hamilton felt like he had no choice. If the other side is going to organize to defeat my ideas, which I believe are right, I have no choice but to organize a political party to kind of fend them off, to fight them off. So on the screen here I wrote stability and can't we just all get along? Somewhat humorously, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But the answer really was probably no. We can't really get along. President Washington implored these two brilliant figures in American history, Hamilton and Jefferson, to try to put their differences to rest. And they kept kind of promising that they would, but they couldn't do it. They just could not do it. So they disagreed on everything. The two political parties then came to be opposed on almost everything, and these two hated each other. So it sets up a quite contentious, dramatic, and often sort of nasty politics during the 1790s. There was a special relationship between Washington and Hamilton, partly because they'd worked together throughout the American Revolution. So they knew each other's habits and abilities and personalities extremely well. And they complemented each other perfectly, as it says here. Washington understood that Hamilton was a genius and a young man in a hurry. Hamilton had started the war at 21 years old. He takes office here as Secretary of the Treasury at only 35. It's pretty young to hold that high a position in government. But Hamilton had a lot to prove. Came from a underprivileged background outside of the colonies, in a tiny island in the Caribbean. So he was always out to prove himself and had a bit of recklessness and restlessness in him. As I already noted, he sometimes could get out of control. But with George Washington around as kind of a father figure, a guy that kind of guided him, the one person that Hamilton really respected, probably the only person that could really rein Hamilton in because of who George Washington was and what their early relationship had been. Washington, a middle-aged guy, Hamilton, young, and though confident, had no choice but to kind of respect and listen to Washington. So he got into that habit early on. So Washington could take Hamilton's brilliant, in a hurry thinking, genius ideas and temper them a bit with prudent decision-making. Clip Hamilton's wings a bit in a way that probably helped both of them. So just saying, okay, Hamilton, your ideas are good, but let's slow down. Let's do this first, and then the second, and then we'll try this later on. We're not going to do all those things at one time. We have to do this carefully and in a more measured way, at a more measured pace. So they complement each other extremely well. And they pretty much worked together. Remember, Washington was a non-party Federalist. He didn't join Hamilton's party, but he agreed with Hamilton's ideas more often. So in some ways, he might as well have been a Federalist. So this actually was a working relationship. It was Hamilton that had the brilliant ideas most of the time. It's Washington that exercised judgment about whether they were workable, realistic or not, and sort of how they were going to be implemented. But on the other side, as we'll see, the dynamic duo, the collaboration between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison was an equally great political duo, sometimes seen as the greatest in American history. These are two talented individuals in politics and as intellectuals, and you put both of their brains together and you have quite a force. These two guys complement each other as well. Jefferson being the long-term political strategist, as you see in front of you, meaning Jefferson, and this is one of his greatest gifts, Jefferson he was extremely adept at foreseeing kind of the political future, not through a crystal ball, but just through his ability to think, his insight, his intuition. He could sort of say, well, here's where we are now. Public opinion is here, but it's likely to be moving in this direction in the next 5 or 10 years, so we need to go that way if we want to keep up with public opinion. If we want to stay on top of politics or get on top of politics, we need to go there. But then it's kind of like, and I don't mean this literally, but it's kind of like Jefferson would leave the room and say, okay, Mr. Madison, now you're the guy who needs to figure out the details of how we plot a course to get from here to there. And then we take off and leave Madison to sort of plot the details. Now Madison, of course, was a gifted long-term thinker himself, but Jefferson was the senior partner in this informal collaboration. It's hard to believe that Madison could be second place to anybody at this point after everything's accomplished, but Jefferson was older, again, author of the Declaration of Independence, from a sort of the generation just before. So Jefferson became the senior partner and Madison the number 2 guy. Again, saying something about the talent of the two put together. And this brings us to another issue with regard to James Madison himself. Some historians have actually asked the question, is there a James Madison problem? And what they mean by that is trying to figure out why he switched sides. Because by all intents and purposes, Madison should have been a Federalist. Remember, he was an ally and friend of Alexander Hamilton. It was largely the two of them in Annapolis, Maryland, that scheduled the Constitutional Convention for the following year, because both of them believed so strongly that the Articles of Confederation were too weak and that they needed a national government made of much stronger stuff. Also keep in mind that they co-authored the Federalist Papers together. So it appears that Madison had a big change of heart. Is it possible that James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, in just a few years had changed his mind since Philadelphia about the need for a strong national government? I think that's impossible, and it's not true. But I think the best, and historians again have debated this for a long time, the best possible answer we have comes from, among others, Gordon Wood, one of the leading experts on this time period at Brown University, who said that Madison was, quote, a nationalist, but not Hamilton's kind of nationalist. By nationalist, he means believer in strong national government. This is to say, to translate this for you, that Madison and Hamilton agreed on strong national government as an absolute need, but they hadn't gotten into the details because it hadn't been necessary at that point. It was kind of, that was in the future. But now, as they got down to the details, as they both became members of government, now implementing the Constitution, once Madison saw Hamilton's detailed plan, and we're going to see it too, for how to turn America into a national power worldwide, but also at the same time, these two go hand in hand, the way in which Hamilton wanted to create a powerful national government, Madison, in a sense, said, wait, slow down. I want to get to the same direction you do. I want to get that there, which is strong national government. But I didn't know you were going to take this route. I didn't know you were planning to take this road, and I believe this road is fraught with dangers. There's rock slides and mudslides, and it's too windy and uphill. I totally disagree with taking this route to get to national government, and so I believe we need to go that route. And so it's the details, I think. Once Madison realized that Hamilton's plan to get to strong national government and to make the United States into a powerful and wealthy country included the details that it did, the way that he wanted to do it, Madison could not accept it and literally went to the other side and helped to Jefferson to form the Republican Party. And they formed that party, the first American political party, primarily to oppose Hamilton's plan, his program, his set of steps in order to make the national government strong and to make the United States strong. The first Congress of the United States began in March of 1789 in New York City at Federal Hall, which you see pictured here. The first Capitol was in New York City. It's not very well known, although we'll find out quickly it doesn't stay there for very long. This chart, which is rather noisy, shows us a couple of things of value. It says Democratic-Republican on here, just to, I think, make things difficult for students. The Republican Party of Jefferson, its full name was the Democratic-Republican Party. That's like bound to make students' heads explode because it's the name of both of our political parties today. But keep in mind, Democrat and Republican are just words. And they shortened the name oftentimes to Republican Party. We should keep in mind that this is not today's Republican Party. You should really keep that in mind or you're going to get things wrong. So it's just the same name. This is not the party of Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan or Paul Ryan, or take your pick of today's Republicans, but it's a different party entirely. But it shows the numbers that the Republicans had in Congress, on the upper half in the House and the lower half in the United States Senate. And there's two things I want you to remember from this out of these statistics, and that is that if you look at 2-year increments every election year, presidential elections and then midterm, presidential midterm, and on, that in the 1790s, the decade we're looking at now, the Federalists either always controlled both houses of Congress or controlled one of the two. So they were the dominant party. But from 1800 on, and that will be the subject of our next unit, but you should remember this, not only did the Republicans turn it around, and this is just in Congress, but they do so big time. Look at the percentage numbers that they have here. We're talking about 82% some years, 75, 79, 71, 92, 86, and so their lead is big and getting bigger and bigger all the time. After 1800, when Thomas Jefferson becomes third president of the United States, the Federalists never held the White House again, and they never had a majority in Congress again, ever. So from 1800 on, not only is power shifted from the Federalists to the Republicans, but from that time, it's a growing blowout. And the Republicans eventually send the Federalists, their opponents, out of business. And we'll kind of see we'll see some things that will help us make sense out of how and why this actually happened as we go along. I also wanted to point out before we go further that there's a lot of other politicians and political leaders, some of them famous. The one on the lower right, Richard Henry Lee, there's a new biography out on him by an historian. So these were big-name guys in their day. And I'm not going to ask you, even though they're on the outline, I'm not going to ask you questions about them here. But I like to do this just because the textbooks, and in a class like this, a survey course, we talk about kind of the same 6 guys all the time: Franklin, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, and on. And it can sound like those are the only 6 people that ever made decisions. But just like today's democracy, there were lots of politicians at both the national and state level, and many of them played an important role. On the left, Fisher Ames was one of Hamilton's Federalist allies in the House, helped him push legislation, his program and plans through. Rufus King in the Senate did the same thing, was also a personal friend of Hamilton's. And on the right side, you see 2 Republicans, kind of the point men for the Republican Party in Congress, like the other 2 were point men for the Federalist agenda or platform in Congress. William Branch Giles often played that role in the House, and Richard Henry Lee in the Senate. So I do like to just at least point that out. We're simplifying things by talking about the big names today. So Federalists and Republicans, the beginnings of a 2-party system. Remember, this was not talked about at the Constitution at all. There's absolutely zero in the Constitution about political parties. Zero. They aren't mentioned at all. So this is maybe the number one example of something I said at the outset, and that is this decade is largely about filling in the blanks that the Constitution had not filled in. The Constitution was a blueprint and a blueprint only. What we see here, we're going to skip the third part of this about English-style government, but the Federalists as good administrators and policymakers. And that's mainly because they were the ones in control of government. They have Washington, at least, who's extremely sympathetic to their ideas, and the Washington administration, with the exception of Thomas Jefferson, who's the creator of the other party. It's mostly Federalists in the important executive, administrative, bureaucratic positions. And Hamilton maybe being in the number 1 position as Secretary of the Treasury. The Treasury Department was by far the biggest department in that day. So Hamilton taking the lead, the Federalists got really good as administrators and policymakers, partly because they were the ones getting experience doing it. The Republicans wanted to be administrators, policymakers, bureaucrats, and they were then struggling to win the presidency, to win majorities in Congress, but we know they weren't able to do that, at least for a number of years. But look at number 2, the Republicans as good politicians. This makes sense because they want to become the administrators, the policymakers, the presidents, the majority in Congress. But to do that, they have to win elections. And that's what I mean there by good politicians. There are other things that a politician does, of course, but this means they got good at doing election campaigns. They got good at electoral politics. They got good at electioneering. And they had to, if in fact they wanted to win, and if they wanted to defeat the other side, the Federalists, whose ideas we know, Hamilton's particularly, they thought were bad and dangerous for the country. So they started working hard at figuring out how to defeat their Federalist counterparts. And this already gets us back to that chart where I said we'll see some sort of reasons why, how the Republicans not only go from being the minority party to being the dominant party and eventually putting the Federalists out of business entirely. The Federalists certainly helped them. While the Republicans were getting good at winning elections, the Federalists were hardly working at it at all. And I'm exaggerating a bit in saying that, but there's kind of 2 reasons for it. One, the Federalists were the more old-fashioned party, more conservative, at least in that sense. They weren't more conservative in every way, but in that sense they were. They were the ones at the Constitutional Convention, those that become Federalists afterwards, who had the least to say that was positive about democracy. So the Federalists tended to be snobs. They tended to think that power should be in the hands of elites, rich people, and didn't think much of the average person, of the general public. And so they didn't kind of believe in going out and doing political campaigns where like politicians today will shake hands with everybody and kiss babies and tell everyone what they want to hear and say and kind of whisper sweet nothings in the ear of the public. The Federalists disdained doing that much of the time, especially guys like Washington and Hamilton. So they kind of thought it was beneath them to go out there and shake hands with kind of the unwashed masses as they saw them. Secondly, as long as George Washington was around, he was around for about 8 years here as president, the Federalists didn't have to work that hard to win elections because Washington was like a nuclear weapon they had in their arsenal. So if somebody was running for Congress as a Federalist and everybody knew he's an ally of Washington, that would really help him get elected. Oh, you're with Washington? Oh, okay. We'll vote for you. So they had that weapon in their arsenal that the Republicans didn't. Nobody had the clout and the respect that from the public that Washington got and had. But that shows that the Federalists weren't thinking very far ahead, of course, because Washington was only going to be around for so long because people get old and eventually retire and die. So they weren't thinking ahead. So while the Federalists were more or less neglecting figuring out how to win democratic politics, and this was rapidly becoming, or gradually I should say, becoming a democratic system, the Republicans were figuring out how to do democratic politics and kind of saying, hey, if you guys aren't going to go out and shake hands and kiss babies, we will. If you're not going to tell the people what they want to hear, we will, and we'll defeat you that way. And so they started getting really good at playing sort of the sort of election game. And Alexander Hamilton believed his whole life. I don't think he was entirely right about this, but he was probably partially right. He thought. Remember, they don't like each other, but he thought that Thomas Jefferson had no higher opinion of the public than he did. He thought just, at least I'm honest about it, and I'm open that I don't think the public, sort of has it in them to, talk and sort of do anything, be involved in politics. Jefferson thinks the same thing. He just is a phony and he lies to them so he can get elected. I don't think that's totally true. Maybe not even mostly true, but I think there's a grain of truth in it. But the Republicans nonetheless figured it out. Whether they were, sincere in telling the public, some nice things about them, it helped them to win. And one of the things that we see is that the Republican Party got good at political propaganda really quickly. And this political poster from the time period is my absolute favorite. That's why I put it here. There are a lot of such things. But This is a great one, and it shows how advanced the propaganda and advertising, political advertising was. They didn't have TV, of course, computers in those days, so this is the kind of thing that would be done. But in the middle of this is a Republican campaign against the Federalists. Jefferson and Clinton. George Clinton was a New York politician. But it says, down with the Tories, down with the British faction. What does this mean? It's accusing the Federalists of being Tories. Remember, Tories were those people that had stayed loyal to Great Britain during the American Revolution. And Tory was a very derogatory term. It was like, calling somebody, some sort of bad word. Down with the British faction, the British party. They're saying these people are pro-British. This is the pro-British party that we're up against. And this, we'll see, had great resonance, because even though it wasn't really true, or it wasn't true, none of these guys on the other side, none of the Federalists here were Tories, but it could look that way and be made to look that way because of the public's, sort of remembrance of the American Revolution. And the Revolution wasn't that far gone. There were still many families that had lost loved ones in that revolution, and so there was still a bitterness and raw emotion towards and against the British. And so if the Republicans could find any way to link the Federalists to the British, and say, hey, those two are together, then the public, who hated the British already, were likely then to dislike the Federalists. That was the plan, sort of tie the Federalists to the British. And Alexander Hamilton, frankly, made it pretty easy to do, because, as we'll see, his whole plan and program for turning America into a wealthy and powerful country included emulating British institutions, British ways of doing things, and normalizing relations with them, which was perfect for the Republicans. They hated it. Jefferson hated the idea of normalizing relations with Great Britain, but he also realized that the rest of the public, or much of the public, would hate it too, and played it up. At the bottom of the poster, it says, vote for Jefferson and Clinton, who fought their country's battles in the year 1776, basically meaning in the Revolution, which is just an outright lie. But I'm saying that shows how gifted, how ahead of its time this political propaganda was. Political propaganda today is often not true, to the very least stretching the truth, but it can work. It doesn't need to be true, it just needs to be perceived as true by the public. And the Republicans are already well aware of this, and so this is sophisticated electioneering. This is sophisticated campaigning, even if it's not totally honest, because they're turning this around. Who fought their country's battles in the year 1776. Well, Jefferson certainly served patriotically, politically during the Revolution. Continental Congress, was governor of Virginia for part of the Revolution as well. But he never served in the military. Remember, Alexander Hamilton was in the military through the entire war and risked his life in the charge into Redoubt Number 10 at Yorktown, leading a battalion into hand-to-hand combat. So this is basically aimed, this poster, at Hamilton and his party, and saying Hamilton and his party are a bunch of traitors. They're pro-British. Wait a minute. And we, the Republicans, Mr. Jefferson, and we Republicans fought the British. Like, actually, Jefferson didn't fight in the military, and Hamilton did. So this is the kind of political propaganda that's scoring points with the public and helps us explain, again, how after 1800 the Republicans win the White House, both houses of Congress, and end up blowing out the Federalists and sending them into extinction over time. A big part of all this were the press wars that went on, and both political parties came to use the press a great deal. And the political press that I mentioned at the outset, which is kind of around today, not that it hasn't changed at all, but was basically sort of established here, meaning the idea that the press has a strong role to play in politics. In a democratic system, I think we tend to, today anyway, underappreciate how large a role the press actually plays, or the media, we should say, today. But it plays a huge role. Some commentators and academics have referred to the press, sometimes in the media, as another branch of government, kind of an unofficial branch of government. So it's become important and already was here. The paper you see on the left, the National Gazette, was a Republican newspaper, and it was the most famous one. It was kind of like the unofficial, official Republican newspaper. And on the right, the Gazette of the United States was kind of like the unofficial, official organ of the Federalists. Gazette, by the way, both of them with the title Gazette, is just another word for paper. Like there's Times or Tribune or Examiner today. Gazette was just another common name for a newspaper. But these were almost the official papers of one party and the other. And the press wars got brutal. Much of the time, the Republican newspapers went after Alexander Hamilton and said all kinds of terrible things, called him a bastard, as we already know, but kept accusing him of being a fraud and trying to defraud the government in his capacity as Secretary of the Treasury, since he's the guy who dealt with the money, and accused him of it all the time. Thomas Jefferson hired the equivalent of journalistic hitmen. James Callender, who became famous, Philip Freneau, who became famous, and others who were hired essentially to write just these horrible things about the Federalists. Later, John Adams too, at this point, mainly Hamilton. Not Washington, because they were smart enough to realize Washington is so popular that if we attack him openly, there's going to be a backlash against us. So they sort of aimed directly under Washington. The guy right underneath him was really Alexander Hamilton, the next most powerful Federalist or supporter of the Federalists' policy prescriptions. And so they went after Hamilton. Hamilton usually sort of fought back. He would actually write his own defenses in the Gazette of the United States. Jefferson would get others to write for him. And he'd respond every time, and even sort of show the Treasury Department's numbers. If you think I'm defrauding the government, here's the math, here are the numbers, add it up for yourself. There it is. There's our pocketbook. Here's our payments. Here's our budget. And every single time the numbers came out, they came back clean. And yet each time the Republicans, led by Jefferson, who hated Hamilton and was convinced that he was a fraud, would say, the numbers would come back like, okay, there's like no sign of fraud here. And Jefferson and his cohort would say, oh my God, this is worse than we thought. This guy's such a fraud, and he's so brilliant at it, he can hide every single number here and make them all look clean. And so then they would do it again and accuse him another time. It would come back clean, and oh my God, it's even worse than we thought. This guy's diabolically clever and dangerous because he's able to keep this thing a secret. So you can see that Hamilton couldn't win here, because if they'd found the fraudulent numbers, they would have then said he's a fraud. And then when they don't find the fraudulent numbers, they keep saying, aha, that just proves that he's a fraud. So this is a good example of confirmation bias. Jefferson and the Republicans were already convinced that Hamilton was a fraud. And the reason that the numbers kept coming back clean every time Hamilton was accused is because there's no evidence that he was a fraud whatsoever. Hamilton had a lot of flaws, but being a fraud in his position as Secretary of the Treasury doesn't appear to have been one of them.